They flew me out to Kestrel 9 on a transport so old the recycled air still smelled like the last 3 cargoes it had carried. Machine grease, then citrus disinfectant, then nothing at all. That was Kestrel 9 in a smell, a post that had outlived its purpose and was just waiting to be told to stop. I'd been a relay technician for the Concorde's outer listening network for 6 years, and in that time I had learned exactly one thing worth knowing. When a job comes with a tribunal proctor attached, it is never the job they tell you it is. They told me it was a routine binding, a contract of convenience they called it, the kind the Concorde used when an inconvenient bloodline needed to be quietly moved off the succession ledger without a public trial. All I had to do was sign as the outside party, receive a stipend, never speak of it again. I didn't ask why they needed a nobody like me instead of one of their own. I'd learned not to ask questions with obvious answers. A Concorde noble marrying a Concorde noble, even for paperwork, would need witnesses, appeals, 100 cousins with opinions. A relay tech from a dead-end outpost had no family to object and no standing to refuse. She came through the annex doors at 0600 station time, and the first thing I understood about Seylan Vora Nishara was that she had already made peace with being erased. She didn't look at me the way I expected, furious, or frightened, or even proud in the brittle way people get right before they lose something. She looked at me the way you look at a form you've filled out so many times you've stopped reading the print. Polite, distant, already somewhere else. "You're the signature," she said, not a question. "Joss called her," I said, because it felt wrong not to give her that much. She inclined her head exactly the amount protocol required, and no more. Behind her, Magistrate Kessa Orr came through the doors with a folio thick enough to stop a hatch, and I understood then that this wasn't a wedding, it was a filing. The magistrate laid it out plain, because he assumed I wouldn't care enough to listen. The Nishara court had found a flaw in Seylan's birth telemetry, some old genetic marker the astrologers of her line considered unlucky, though nobody in the room could tell me what it actually did to a person besides give her a bad number on a ledger. Under Concorde law, an heir with a disqualifying marker couldn't simply be removed from succession. She had to be bound to someone outside the court first. Once bound, her claim transferred automatically, quietly, to a cousin waiting 3 systems away. The contract wasn't a marriage. It was a legal amputation with a human standing in as the blade. "She'll retain a stipend and a name," the magistrate said, like he was reading me a shipping manifest. "You'll retain a stipend and your silence. The binding itself is a formality. It need not be consummated, honored, or acknowledged beyond this room." I looked at Seylan when he said that. She didn't flinch. She'd clearly heard the word formality applied to herself so many times it had stopped landing anywhere at all. I asked to see the folio. The magistrate hesitated. Nobody signing away a stranger's claim had ever asked to read it before, but he handed it over, more amused than concerned. I read slower than I needed to, because I wanted to see if anyone would stop me. Nobody did. It was worse than he'd said. The transfer clause didn't just move her claim to the waiting cousin. It stripped her of court residency, her staff, her mother's old rooms, effective the hour the contract was filed. She wasn't being demoted. She was being put out. "Does she know this part?" I asked, and I heard my own voice come out rougher than I meant it to. "She signed the summary," the magistrate said. "The particulars aren't required reading for the bound party." I looked at Seylan again. This time she was looking at me, and something in her face had shifted. Not hope, nothing that generous yet, just the flicker of someone noticing that a stranger had bothered to ask a question on her behalf at all. "You didn't know," I said to her. "It doesn't change the outcome," she said, steady, rehearsed. "The marker is real. The court is right to remove it." "The marker's not the part I'm asking about," I said. "The rooms are." She didn't have an answer for that. I don't think anyone had ever separated the two questions for her before, whether the flaw was real, and whether what they were doing to her because of it was fair. She'd spent so long absorbing the first, that she'd stopped examining the second. I told the magistrate I needed an hour before I signed. He didn't like it, told me the transport back to the main line was in 90 minutes and Kestrel 9's skeleton crew, 4 of us, counting the cook, had better things to do than babysit a bureaucratic courtesy. I told him I'd make the transport. I didn't tell him what I intended to do with the hour. I spent it with Seylan in the relay bay, where the old dish still turned on its bearing out of habit more than function, sweeping a black sky it hadn't found anything new in for a decade. She stood by the viewport with her hands folded the way court taught her, and I stood next to her with a stub of pencil I'd been chewing on since my last shift, and for a while neither of us said anything worth writing down. Then she asked me why I'd bothered reading the folio. "Because a form's worth reading before you sign your name to what it does to someone else," I said. Even if the someone else has already decided it doesn't matter. It's easier if it doesn't matter, she said quietly. I've had a long time to make it not matter. I know the feeling, I told her, and meant it. 6 years on a dying relay post will teach a man plenty about making things not matter. Doesn't mean it's true. She didn't answer that either, but she didn't look back at the sky the way she had a moment before. She looked at me instead, like she was recalculating something. When the hour was up, I went back to the annex and told the magistrate I'd sign, on one condition. The binding would stand as written in every legal particular he required. But the transfer clause, the rooms, the staff, the erasure of her name from the residency roll, that I would not sign as written. If the Concord wanted my signature on this contract, the rooms stayed hers, in my name if the law required a name at all. The magistrate told me I had no standing to renegotiate Concord succession law. I've got exactly the standing you gave me an hour ago, I said. You told me I was the outside party this contract needs, so I'm the outside party telling you what I'll put my name to. It shouldn't have worked. Legally, I doubt it should have. But the 4 of us on that station, me, the cook, the 2 junior techs who'd wandered in to watch a wedding turn into an argument, were the only witnesses the Concord had bothered to bring, and the magistrate hadn't planned for any of us to actually read the fine print, let alone push back on it. He amended the clause rather than fly back empty-handed and explained to his superiors why a relay tech had stalled a routine filing. I signed it standing up, at a folding table that had held nothing more ceremonial than ration counts in a decade. Salen signed after me, and her hand didn't shake, but for the first time since she'd walked through those doors, she wasn't somewhere else while she did it. You didn't have to do that, she said afterward, once the magistrate had gone, and it was just the 4 of us in the dish still turning outside. No, I agreed. But you didn't have to stand there and let them read you off like cargo either. Figured we could both stop doing things we didn't have to do. She almost smiled. It was the first expression I'd seen on her that wasn't rehearsed. The transport left without me an hour later than scheduled. I told the magistrate I'd take the next one out, whenever that turned out to be. Salen Vora Nishara stayed in her mother's old rooms, the ones that were legally hers again, in a dead man's paperwork kind of way, and I stayed on as the relay tech Kestrel 9 had never bothered to replace. Nobody in the Concord court has acknowledged the binding as anything more than an administrative footnote. That's fine by me. I didn't sign it to be acknowledged. I signed it because a woman walked into a filing room already convinced she was a formality, and somebody needed to prove the paperwork wrong before she believed it about herself for good. She still keeps the folio, the amended page folded into the binding, in a drawer by the relay bay. Some nights she reads it over again, not because the words have changed, but because she's still getting used to what it feels like when they're finally true.